Nana, no need. मैं अपने कहीं नहीं दिखानी होती तुम्हारी कॉपी. मैं अपने स्कॉलर्स की कॉपी किधर जगह किधर होती है, जगह कहाँ रखने की. Okay, the recording has begun. We yesterday were looking at which case?
Palini.
Palini
Konda.
Kondan case.
Yeah, we kind of, I don't know whether it's Palini or not, but we are used to calling it Palani Gowden, even though they're simple A's and we do not know the exact one. So what is the lesson we have from Palani Gowden? बाहर से खोला छोड़ के चलना, कोई बात खोल दो. Just 1 second. That was my research scholar who needed my signatures on her PhD work. She's going to submit. So, okay, Parani Gowden, what is the question that we're dealing with? Coexistence of the relationship between mens rea and actus reus. So we do know that both of them are required. So if there are, whether the two instances in this case, one of hitting the wife and you can't hear. Why can you not hear? Nobody else can hear me?
Ma'am, you're audible.
Ma'am, you're audible.
Yeah, so then student who has written you can't hear, it's a problem at your end. There are Pramod and Nishant. So it's your network issue, I think. It will come back again. So the two things that, so whether the two instance, whether the what has happened in this case are two instances or these are part of one series of instances. Because we said act does include acts. So whether the two acts, whether the act of hitting the wife and then hanging her body, part of the same transaction, or these were two independent transactions, that may determine whether the state of mind at what point of time will count. And the second thing was also whether state of mind as determined by the facts I believe or the facts as they existed. So as an accused person, I believe that my wife was dead, while actually she was not dead. So if I believed her to be dead, and if I hang the body, I'm only hanging a body. So I should be held with that offense only and not the offense of murder, because I had no intention or knowledge that my act will result into her death, because for me she is already dead. So whether it is my subjective knowledge which should determine, majority said subjective knowledge. No, they said objective. Sorry. And the majority said that because he thought it was a dead body, he had no intention to cause death. And his intention in hanging the body was to destroy the evidence. And therefore, no liability. The liability for murder will not come. The liability will come for other two sections, one of causing hurt and the other for destruction of evidence. So this was 1900, which year? 13, I think.
19.
1919.
1919. And we were at the verse. Let me just open the, share the screen with you. Then we can look at the subsequent developments in this field. And you'll find that different courts at different times have decided differently. So then it becomes very confusing as to how do we decide as students, as a beginner in this course, how do we decide what should be our position on this one. So we'll talk about this in a second. The moment we have looked at Kaliappan Gordon. So 1933, from 1919 to 1933, Madras High Court changed its position in this case, where the facts seem to be similar. That the accused person hit the other, hit the wife. She became unconscious, but he thought she was dead, and he put the unconscious body on the railway track, believing her to be dead. The Madras High Court, in a subsequent judgment, says no, he's liable for murder. And the reason given to them was that the two acts are actually a series of acts. They're so intimately connected with each other, and the latter followed immediately upon the former. This cannot be seen as two independent incidents. And therefore, because he should have, no, everybody is assumed to have the knowledge that if you put a body on the railway track, they're going to die. And therefore, liability for murder. But the story doesn't end there. We have Indri Thavmani, that's another case in our materials, where the injuries which were given in the first round were caused with the intention to cause death. And then, believing her to be dead, he threw the body in the well. Injuries were insufficient to cause death. Death occurred due to drowning. So in this case, another Madras High Court judgment, there, that said there was at the beginning an intention to cause death. The intention was apparently carried into effect, but in fact was not. He thought that I've done my job, but actually it had not happened. And if the intention at the second stage of the transaction has been merely to dispose of a dead body, the two phases of the same transaction are so closely connected in time and purpose that they must be considered as part of the same transaction. So they're following the same thing which they have done in Kaliappan versus state. This is from Patna High Court. Again, similar circumstances, because somewhere what we're noticing is that the judges in both Kaliappan and in Thavmani, they said if the intention was to cause death in the first instance, but the person did not die at that stage, the second has to be seen as a continuation of the series. So again, the woman was given a single blow with firewood. She became unconscious, believing her to be dead, set her on fire. The judge said it is not murder, but it is culpable homicide not amounting to murder, because it was a case of gross negligence, and law imputes necessary knowledge. So this is the Patna High Court here is focusing on that the knowledge has to be imputed. The intention to cause death wasn't there. So this is a different approach the Patna High Court has taken. Then we have, this is from the Privy Council, Thabo Mali. Again, similar kind of sex, with intention to kill, gave a blow on the head. Believing him to be dead, rolled his body over the cliff, and he died because of the exposure. So the judge has, the Privy Council has also taken the same line of argument that it is impossible to divide what was really one series of acts. So this is only one series of acts. So therefore, ultimately, what is the lesson that we are learning from this whole series of cases here? The simple principle we are learning is that we have to look at the whole transactions in the circumstances. So if there's certainly in all those cases where the first blow was given with the intention to cause death, but the blow was not sufficient to cause death, or maybe it was sufficient, but it did not cause death. And this was followed immediately by another act. So suppose he had not taken the second act. He gave the first blow with the intention to cause death, and then left the body as it is, and then ran away. Or somebody came and interrupted him at that stage. He would not have been liable for murder, even though he had the intention to cause death, but his act has not resulted in death. So when the first blow has been given with the intention to cause death, followed by another act which is also capable of killing, sometimes the judges have taken that actually the second act was done in furtherance of the first stage. to make sure that yes, this person has committed this offense. Not to ensure that the person does die, to ensure that. So even sometimes the judges have put it in specific words, sometimes they haven't. So, so that's one examination, that whether from the facts and circumstances we can draw an inference that when the first blow was it given with the intention to cause death? If that was the intention, but with that blow the person did not die, and the argument by the parties are that the second act was done only to destroy evidence, judges are not accepting that. But when there is no intention to cause death, and another act has been done under the belief, and we are saying in this case that judges do believe that the person believed so, but whether that belief is sufficient for them to get absolved, no, whether to be absolved from criminal liability. So there the judges are saying no, that nobody is certainly completely absolved of the criminal liability. Palani Gowdan is the most difficult one, because there they could have uh, looked at the whole series of acts together. But maybe in 1919, the thinking, the lawyering, etc., was not so clear on the subject. And this is one of those early cases that we have here. But over the years, when we look at it, so we need to look at it at any given scenario. We have to focus on the fact that whether in these circumstances there can be an inference that the first act was certainly intended to cause death. That's what the judges are saying. So if they're convinced that the um, first act was done, the first injury was given with the intention to cause death, the subsequent act which actually resulted into death are interpreted by the judge as saying these are series of acts. So remember the definition of act, which says act include series of acts. So these are not two independent acts, but these are continuation. They are so interconnected that it cannot be said that the intention differed at the second stage. So, because again, coming back to the whole idea of how to prove intention, how does a person prove that no, my intention has changed now? Even though I wanted to kill him in the first round, but by the time I rolled his body down the cliff, so the intention to kill wasn't there anymore. That was the time I wanted to ensure that the body will not be found if I roll it down the cliff, or if I put it on the railway track. I wanted to kind of make it a case, not look like a case of suicide rather than murder. So, but even in that plea itself, the in Parani Gowdan, what is the person also assuming that the post-mortem report will not show that the ligature mark are post-death or pre-death. And that's also the medical part of it. So certainly this person has no sense of this, that if she is already dead and she hangs the body, the autopsy of the body will indicate that these are post-death and not ante-mortem. This is post-mortem and not ante-mortem. They were not caused before the death. So therefore, the fact that he did not know this, will that be of any help to the person? That I did not know that post-mortem can reveal whether she died before or after. So certainly over the years, we have come to regard that when there are two instances following each other and they are connected to each other, both the acts are not independent, they're connected with the same incident, then they have to be treated as a series of acts. Is any question there? Anything which is troublesome to you? And because in this case, we are not trying to understand what is the difference between culpable homicide and murder. We are not there. We are only onto the question that which acts will be said to have been done in the pursuance of my intention. So
Ma'am, I
what?
have a question.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, in Palani's case, was it right that the court overlooked the post-mortem report and believed the accused's subjective knowledge that he believed the woman to be dead? Like, how will you prove the intention of the accused?
We do not have the case file with us for us to know what all was written there. What we have is a judgment.
Yes, ma'am.
In the judgment, there is no such mention. So, and the judges did not overlook that. Judges did recognize, they took the cognizance of the fact, and because the whole case is about this only, now that the post-mortem report only told us that she died because of the hanging and not because of the injury this man had given.
Hmm. Hmm.
So they've taken cognizance of the post-mortem report.
Hmm.
But the question is that because we are back to the first question, that how do you decide intention?
Yes, ma'am.
So the judges must have looked at the whole relationship between the two, and also the fact that the injury cause was not even a grievous injury.
Hmm. Hmm.
So to infer that if somebody gives only one blow and which is causing only hurt and not grievous hurt even, the judges, nobody can say that he had the intention to kill the wife.
Okay, okay.
So Parani Kaundan is very distinguishable from the other cases where there was enmity or there were much more violent activity. So the judges in those cases said that when the first blow was given itself, there was an intention to kill. So in all cases where the first blow was given with the intention to kill, then the subsequent actions are seen as ensuring that what they set out to do gets completed, even though the person is making an argument that no, this was not my intention when I did the second act. And they are saying our two acts are separate. So we have to determine, how do you ensure that whether they constitute a series of acts or do they constitute independent acts. So in this case, it is the same person who has given two. The simpler examples of that will be that I left the victim on the road. No, I ran over somebody with the intention to kill. So he fell down and I fled the place, assuming that he's dead because he had fainted. Then the person was taken to the hospital by a passerby and he died because, no, then he was treated also for the injuries, but he developed sepsis, infection, and he died of infection. Apparently, it is not the acts alone of the accused person. These are the acts of the other persons in between. So whether the fact that he died of sepsis, and there is an exception written in this in the expression given itself also, that merely because a person could have survived if he was given treatment, sufficient medical treatment, is not a defense which an accused person can take. That if no, I sort of knew that he is kind of injured seriously, but he would have survived if treatment was given to him. But nobody took him to the hospital and he died. So he can't say, oh, if people had taken provided expeditious medical treatment to him, he would have survived. So that's not something he can take. But when there is an active intervention by some other persons and the consequence happened differently, then it is new acts which are intervening, sometimes due to negligence, sometimes due to other reasons. So one will have to look at the full circumstance. But coming back to Palani Gaundan and the subsequent cases, the rule we are learning in this one is that when we determine whether there are two acts in this example or there are series of acts for the no the act as used word is an act. So whether the series of act actually constitute only the total act or whether that's two independent acts. So one is always looking at what was the intention, what were the circumstances. So Patna High Court said that if there is gross negligence, that means you should have at least touched the person, maybe try to feel the pulse, maybe try to see whether this person is breathing. You do nothing and you get to the second one. So even if there was no intention to cause death in the first instance, but you made no effort to find out whether the person is dead or not, and do the second act, which you know certainly that this is going to cause death. So if you don't do that, then you are being grossly negligent. And when you come to the distinction between 299 and 300, we will understand that when negligence is causing death by negligence is under 304A, and when causing death by gross negligence becomes 304. We have seen a lot of cases now, the traffic cases, the hit and run or accidents cases. Quote, when we say accident, in law, accident means there's no intent. But for us, we know lots of accidents are caused by rash and negligent act. So when we have seen, recently there was this case, the Mercedes hit and run, where a 17-year-old, 17 plus something, just I think 4 days less than 18-year-old boy ran over another young fellow. So the judge imposed on him 304 and not 304A, saying that it was so very negligent. And we have had other cases also where in accident matters, the judges have imposed 304. So if a person runs over people sleeping on the road, and not only that, but then he backs up also and runs over them all over again, the judges have said this is not purely negligence, this is gross negligence. And so therefore the judge said that no, and whether it's a negligence or whether it's a gross negligence are all questions of fact. So it may happen that when something happened, and in this case, from this person's perspective, that it was accident, that I thought she was dead. In all these cases, the accused are claiming that we thought we were hanging the dead body. So one thing interesting also from Palani Gowden, the acquitting judges read certain words clarifying the language. When we said any person does an act with intention to cause death, so they have read, it's not written in the section, but they said it has to be assumed that causing death of a living human being. It cannot be, you cannot cause death of somebody who is not living. So this is not need to be written, but it has to be understood in that sense only. So this is how you interpret. So, so what we are learning, three things. One, when you are interpreting, usually the judges interpret criminal law in a strict manner. Strict manner means they will not give a wider interpretation to a criminal liability principle. They can narrow down the scope itself. So in this case, if they were to interpret causing death, irrespective of whether you believed it to be dead or not, then you are expanding the liability in criminal law. So judges said the common sense understanding of it has to be that causing death of a person who is still alive, but the further part with the read was to the knowledge of the accused. So this whole question of what is the role played by the knowledge? How many of us know where are the vital organs in our stomach? Which are the vital organs which can cause death if they are kind of cause trouble? So maybe science students who have learned anatomy, some of the some exposure to medical sciences, people would know. I never had a science subject. I do not know where is liver and where is kidney and where is spleen. So it's only coming to law that I realize that if there's a large spleen and somebody gives a fist blow, the person can die. I did not know this. So if I did not know this, because this was never part of my studies ever, and I gave a blow and this person dies, not knowing that I have given the blow on the spleen, because I do not know where the spleen is. So whether my personal knowledge where exactly is the spleen is important for me to know whether, where exactly is we all know there's no left side of the chest is the heart, but how far inside is the heart? Is it 2 inches beneath, or is it 4 inches beneath? Whether all these technical details, if I do not know, actually, I had no occasion to know it. There's nothing which can be proved that my education at some stage of my point of time told me this is so. So what is the level of knowledge which will still be imputed? You do not know where the heart is exactly 2 inches or 4 inches, but you do know that heart is a sensitive organ, and if it is injured, it can cause death. You give a blow around that place, that's sufficient. It will be assumed that you knew that this injury is likely to. But the whole question that whether we determine the liability by reference to imputing knowledge or by reference to some other things. And we will have a case where the judges have said that we have to look at what was his intention in causing injury, whether the injuries were given intentionally or not. If the injury was given intentionally, then what consequences followed is an objective category. So here in Palani Gaundan, the judge looked at subjective knowledge of the accused, but when it will come to Virsa Singh and Harin, what is the second case?
Surya Narayan Murthy.
Surya Narayan Murthy. So, no, not Surya Narayan Murthy. Punaya. So when we'll read Virsa Singh and Punaya, we will learn that judges are saying that no, only to the extent whether he had given the injury intentionally or not. That's all we need to see. Whether the consequences are capable of killing or not will be the doctors which will tell us. So if we were to apply this to Palani Gaundan, there was no way. But Virsa Singh is, I think, 1965. So we are 64, 65. That this is by that time that some clarity had come as to how do we determine whether, how to determine liability. So before that, Kapoor Singh is shown before Virsa Singh and similar facts. But in Kapoor Singh, the court said, no, he's liable for culpable homicide. So it is only in Virsa Singh and Punaya that we come to a very clearer understanding of the difference between culpable homicide and murder, and also what are the steps to be taken. At this point of time, we are understanding this case from the concept of the definition of act. Act includes series of acts. So the cases together tell us that if the acts are so intermittently connected with each other that they cannot be seen as independent acts, we have to look at the cumulative consequence. And the circumstances in which the two blows were given will determine whether it will be an offense of culpable homicide, whether it will be a case of negligence, whether it will be a case of murder, whether it will be a case of culpable homicide. So which of the categories it will fall into will be a matter to be determined by reference to the overall facts in a given scenario. Any more clarifications? So, okay, we can look to this one more important concept that we need to understand. Which act are my acts? So, Surya Narayan Murthy, the next case we are going to discuss, is about a man who took an insurance on another man. So, in order to claim the insurance money, he tried to poison the insured person. So, he gave him poisoned halwa. This man, the insured man, did not like the halwa taste, so he threw it away. His own niece picked up the halwa and ate some of it and gave some part to it her another child. So these two children died. The insured person suffered serious injuries but recovered. So now the question is that Mushnuru Surya Narayan Murthy, who gave the halwa, whether he's certainly responsible for the injuries and the attempt to life thing on the insured person. So that is not in question. The question is he liable for the death of these two other children? He has not given halwa to them. So whether he can be held liable for the death of these two children is the critical question. So whether the acts which were actually, so there were two acts there. One act was that the insured person threw the halwa. And the second act was that the child herself picked up the halwa. It is the child who gave it to the second child also. So there were these other acts which have ultimately resulted into the death. So whether these acts of the throwing of the halwa can be imputed, whether there is a continuation, the consequences which have occurred after he gave the halwa to the insured person, whether the consequent actions were a series of actions to be imputed on Surya Murthy himself or not. So anyone who has read the case, what do you think the judges have said? And if not read the case, what is your opinion?
Not read the case, but I think it is doctrine of transfer malice, and since he has initially the intention to kill, So it was transferred to those child. So he will be liable for the killing of those child also.
Okay, one thing we also learned in this case that doctrine of malice, the judge majority said, does not apply to India. So therefore, we cannot make an argument on the basis of doctrine of malice. Second one is that even in the doctrine of malice, what we say is that it has to be his acts only while doing the wrongful act. So whether the fact that the accused, the victim, the first victim, the insured person threw the halwa, is that an act of the accused person? Whether the fact that the children themselves picked it up and ate it, is that an act of the accused person? These are the consequences, but whether these are his acts.
But then it could be culpable homicide also, because in culpable homicide, here is an example in which if there is a, for example, A person digs a hole to fall B, to let B fall into hole, but C falls, then A is liable for that. So it could be culpable homicide too.
No, but listen, again, in this example, the illustration you have read, this is very good that you have been reading illustration. There are two acts. One is the act of the accused person who dug the hole. The second one will be said to be contributory negligence, and that's an argument which has been taken, that if there is a contributory negligence, that the other person was negligent and contributed to his own death, and therefore he will not be. So therefore, it is not my act alone. But the illustration says that no, that doesn't make a difference. But in this case, he had not made the halwa for the children. He had no reasonable possibility that the insured person will throw that halwa. He will throw that halwa at a place where there will be children. So one is that whether so who is responsible? So whether the person who threw the halwa, the uncle, the insured person, can he be said to be the one responsible for the children's death? Because he is the one who threw the halwa.
We didn't knew anything that the halwa is poison, so there was no intention as such.
No, ma'am, he will not be.
So certainly he's the uncle. There's no enmity between the brothers, the child's family and Han. So there is no reason for us to think that he wanted the children killed, or he had the knowledge that children will die. So he is out. He cannot be held liable. Now, Mushnaru, whether we can say that he is so closely connected with this, because we said reasonable possibility of consequences, and desire for that is what we say is the intention. So was there any reasonable possibility on part of Mushnaru, Suryanarayan Murthy, that the children will die? So if he could not reasonably foresee, can he be liable for that?
It is his responsibility, ma'am, to know that anybody don't take that halwa, because the act is done by him. He mixed the poison in that halwa and he gave to that lady, but she didn't eat it and she threw it over on the there.
Suppose
the response.
No. But suppose Suryanarayan makes the poison, and one Mr. X saw him mixing the poison. So when Suryanarayan Murthy threw the halwa, this other fellow picked it up and gave that halwa, poison halwa, knowing that it is a poison halwa, to the children. Whether Mushnaru will also still be liable?
No, ma'am, this time he will not be responsible for that act.
Why not? Because he's the one who has mixed the halwa. The other person gave. So certainly the other person who knows that it's a poison halwa will certainly be liable. But whether Mushnaru also should be liable?
Yes, ma'am, he mixed in that halwa.
Ma'am, he had no intention to kill that person.
Ma'am, he has no intention of giving it to anyone. He just threw it. The person who was knowing that it was poison was mixed, he will be responsible for giving poison.
No, no, he will certainly be responsible. There's no doubt about that. The question is that because the halwa was initially prepared by Mushnuru, so should Mushnuru be liable for any number of people who die because of the halwa he poisoned?
Yes, ma'am, he will be responsible. It is a simple
Yes,
case
ma'am,
of
he will be.
intent. So his intent
Yeah,
is
so I think
to
we need to read the case. We need to read the case to understand there are
And he
again
poured
minority.
halwa, he didn't give it to anyone.
Who?
But he mixed
Ma'am,
mixed poison in that halwa that it show the intention. He's going to do something or
for
he's doing
whatever
something wrong.
reason he had mixed, but he had not given it to anyone. If he had transferred it to anyone, then he will be liable.
No, he gave it to one person, the one he intended to kill.
Yes, ma'am.
So
Then he will
assume
be liable.
no. So no, he is liable certainly for this person. If and there has been no question that Mushnuru certainly is liable for the injury he caused to the insured person.
ma'am, any number of deaths.
If he had died, he would have been responsible. Suppose he had given the halwa, the person ate it and died. So the food was lying there. A child came by, picked up that food and ate it and died.
Ma'am, any number of
And
deaths caused by
Mushnuru
that
is liable.
will be responsible to the person who was initially trying to kill someone else, because it is just a case of transfer of intent.
No, but
he
we
wanted
said not
to
transfer of transfer of malice. No, the intention. When we say 301, this says that you intended to kill A, but B died in the same circumstance. So suppose Mushnuru had given the halwa to this fellow, to the insured person. In the presence of Mushnuru, the insured person gives it to his niece also. And Mushnuru doesn't say anything. The insured person does not know it is poison, but Mushnuru knows it is poison. Then it's clear that he allowed this to happen and he knew that this is going to cause the death of the child. So in his presence, this is happening. He goes around distributing in the whole neighborhood any number of people who die, because now he can reasonably foresee that they will all die. And his omission in this is illegal omission. So that's a different case. But here, neither Mushnuru knew that the children will pick up the halwa, nor the insured person knew that the children are going to pick it up. So if it has happened without their knowledge and expectation, so the question is that should a person be liable for all the consequences which follow from his act, or till what point of time, in what circumstances we will say that this effect has been caused because of his action. So this doctrine of cause and effect we learn from Mushnuru, and this will be true. This case is of course in case of murder, but in all cases, whether the injury I have caused is caused by me. So there might be scenarios where, suppose I have given a stab wound, so went to the doctor and doctor operated upon him and there are more injuries were caused because of the operation. So whether all the injuries which occurred because of the operation which was necessitated by my injury, there are also my injuries. So to what extent, what are the principles to determine which acts are my acts and which acts are, now there is a new series of acts beginning. So we need to look at this case that we have here. Anyone who has picked up any principle from this case? What is it that the judges are saying? So we already said, these are the facts. The question is, who is responsible for the children's death? Raj Lakshmi, the 3 children who have died, A and X. So she gave it to 2 children. So intention, we said reasonable possibility of consequences plus the desire for that. Okay. So in this case, was there a reasonable possibility that the children will die? Did he desire the children to die? He's got no interest in children. His only interest was death of this person so that he can claim the insurance money. So intended consequences are always foreseeable but foreseen may not be intended. This is coming from the medical category. So when the doctors, this is an exception to the general principle in that sense, that when doctors operate on somebody, they sometimes can foresee that maybe this person will die. But even without the operation, he will die. So they can foresee that it's a possible consequence, but that is not an intended consequence. When their doctors are operating, they're not intending the consequence. So there's a difference between the scenario that even though we can reasonably foresee the consequence, and when we operate, we put full attention to that action that we're doing, but the desire is not for the consequences that follow, even though they might be foreseeable. So it is important to remember that intended consequences are always foreseen, but foreseen may not be intended. Expected consequences are usually intended, but not necessarily so. So this is specifically applying to the doctors, that expected consequences, the death may occur, they may be knows that, but it is not necessary that they must be expecting it, they must be desiring it also. And as we have said earlier, intention is an inference. This is the revision of the principle we have learned on intention. So knowledge we need to know, it's the distinction between the two. It's a mental cognition of a thing. So how many of us know that I am overweight? Not I, each one of us. I am of course overweight. So we might have the knowledge that I am overweight, but we may not intend to do anything about it. So it is just a mental awareness of something. It's not necessary that one will take something. If you are obese, we know the consequences also. But we're not desiring that. Our attention is not the consequences. So we know that this can happen, but we're not paying attention to the consequences. So this is falling short of intention. So knowledge has to be that there is a certain level of awareness, knowledge imputed to everybody. Everybody seems to know, is assumed that everybody knows that heart is the key to our life. That no, you should know it. These are certain level of knowledges which are imputed, certain knowledge which can be proved. Motive, as we said earlier, something that prompts a man to form an intention, a longing for the desired object, which sets the volition in motion. When young boys, when the girl says no to them, they throw acid on them. What do you think is the motive?
Revenge. Maybe.
Revenge, and then also ensuring you said no to me, now nobody will marry you. So this is the articulation of this person's motive. So it's not that your motive has to be that I will benefit. I am not going to benefit. मैं तो डूबूंगा तो मैं भी ले डूबूंगा. But in fact, that man will not डूबो. It's a woman who has been scarred for life. But make sure that it is not a sine qua non. Sine qua non means it's not a precondition required. It's not essential for conviction. There are very exceptional circumstances where motive can determine liability. Burglary, abduction are two examples, and we'll come to that. Then when we come. So ordinarily, proving a motive is not essential. What is essential is mens rea and actus reus. Why did you do that is not none of the business of the prosecution. Yes? Somebody said something? Okay. But if we can find a motive, as we have found in Rawalpant Benkalu, then it reinforces the inference that this strengthens the case that no, he had a reason to kill Moinuddin, because there was a fight also earlier. We do not know what was the motive of the other person, Bodlaram. No, Benkalu. We know the Bodlaram had an enmity. So certainly, It's relevant and important only to determine whether the inference of intention is reinforced. But merely if in a case we cannot find what the motive is, suppose we did not find any kind of enmity between Bodharam and Venkalu on one side and Vanadun on the other side, the action would still be intentional murder, because it is not motive which determines intention. Motive only reinforces an inference of intention. So issue in this one is whether intention to kill or the knowledge of likelihood of death by offender's action must be found to exist with reference to actual deceased, or does it cover death of persons never encompassed by him? That's what the technical issue is here. Did accused be said to have accused have caused the death of have? And majority says yes, minority says no. So we have both viewpoints again here, and it's a very, very well argued judgment. From the lawyer's perspective, when you read this judgment, you can see that by emphasizing different sections, you can make a different opposite argument. Minority judge talks about voluntarily. His whole thing hinges on the argument based on voluntarily, while the others are focusing on the language. So Justice Benson says words in section are if caused the death, it is culpable. And it does not use the word voluntarily causes death. So please have a look at it. There's a definition clause. Take out the definition of voluntarily. You found it? Anyone found the definition of voluntarily?
Yes, ma'am. Section 39.
Please read.
A person is said to cause an effect voluntarily when he causes it by means whereby he intended to cause it, or by means which, at the time of employing those means, he knew or had reason to believe to be likely to cause it.
Right. So he said that's what one approach to the argument has been, that unless I can reasonably foresee the consequences, I desire those consequences, then I cannot be said to have caused it. But Justice Benson says that the section uses the word causes the death. So it's a technical definition, whoever causes death. And it is not, there's no question of reasonable forcibility in this case. The further argument reason is section 299 does not require that the offender should intend to kill any particular person. So they are referring to section 301, that even if you intended to kill one, another dies. Not necessarily the death be caused without voluntary action by deceased and by some other person. Illustration 2. So illustration 1 we already heard, where the person walks. So it is not necessary that it should be not necessary that death be caused without voluntary action by the deceased, because the person who walked into the pit was his own action. The illustration says nothing doing. Illustration 2, you want to read it quickly? What the illustration 2 says? I think we'll have to stop today at this mid-juncture. So look at illustration 2, look at the other reasons by Justice Benson and contrast them with the other one. So you will see that how the two judges have approached the question differently. And that's an important, okay, attendance, please mark. So this is an important learning for a lawyer, that one can decide what will be your point of argument. What are the sections you're going to emphasize on? And both of them are very convincing. It will be very difficult till the time, not that you are convinced one way or another. It's technically, it's true that the majority decides, but the arguments on both the sides are so very powerful. So what do we learn from here? We need to learn what were the principles laid down to determine what are the consequences of my act, which are said to be consequences caused by my act. That's the principle we will learn at the end of the day. But we need to also know what is it that the three set of judges have said in this case. So we'll continue with this tomorrow, and we will take up any questions you have still left over from the discussion so far before we move on to the next aspect of determining, of looking at, then we'll move on to the strict liability then. Yeah. So after this next week, from Tuesday onwards, we will start looking at the exception to the principle. The first principle we said, no person is liable unless they had the necessary mens rea, actus non praesertium, nisi mens et rea. The exception to that we will look after we have completed this conversation. Please read this case. Don't have to write full present. P is enough for me. And 1P is also enough. Don't have to have more than 1P. And I would suggest that before tomorrow's class, everybody read these two cases, Palani Gowden and Suryanarayan Murthy, so that if there is something which is not clear to you from the class conversation, may perhaps become clear, or it may be that you think everything is clear, but when you read it, you find that no, there's some things which you do not understand. So either way, my suggestion is that everybody please spend time today to read these two cases so that we can conclude this discussion tomorrow. Any volunteers will say, yes, we will read it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. We will read it.
Yes,
Everybody should put their hands up. Everybody's
Yes,
hand
ma'am.
should be up. Great. That's the class I want. Everybody should have read it by tomorrow so that we can actually concretize our base for this course. These are our, as I said, these are the foundation of understanding in criminal law. So all those who have
Is
put
there
P,
any
they can leave the class.
Ma'am,
Specific?
ma'am, is there any specific way to how to read the case? There is,
What do you think we did while we were reading Venkalu's case?
ma'am, I mean, ma'am, there is like words, some voluntary, and their explanation in given in Fair Act. How to read these all things. Ma'am.
We'll come to when we will start looking at legislation, we'll look at that. But as of now, we were not looking at the actual language per se, but we were only trying to understand the concepts under those words. So reading a case is different than reading a statute.
Okay.
In 3 years, this is the only thing that you will learn, how to read a statute and how to interpret words in a statute or in a judicial case, judicial decision. 3 years में इतना ही सिखाते हैं हम. The skill to be able to give meaning to statutory provisions and judicial decisions by your own. Because law is so vast, we cannot teach you every law. And even if we teach you something today, maybe by the time you pass out, the law has changed. Amendments have taken place, new interpretations come in. So law is such an evolving thing that we can never teach you full law. We can only teach you the skill how to read law. So this is the job in the 3 years that you will learn. If
Okay.
everybody has put, I will stop because I also have another class and I know you also have another class.